The Retirement Café podcast, a preview of the Retirement Café Handbook with TED global legend Rory Sutherland. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Retirement Café podcast with me, your host, Justin King. If you're thinking about your retirement or already retired, you're in the right place. My aim is to help you plan for and live a successful and meaningful retirement. Retirement is far more than just a financial event. It's a significant life event, a major transition, which will bring with it new challenges and opportunities. So each episode contains tips, information, and inspiration to help you feel more informed and confident about your retirement. I hope you enjoy today's episode. The wait is finally over. My much anticipated book, well, certainly anticipated by me at least, is called The Retirement Café Handbook, 9 Accelerators for a Successful Retirement. It's now available to pre-order on Amazon. Writing this book has been a labour of love. It's officially released on the 12th of September, so I will be celebrating by switching interview seats with a true icon of personal finance, my good friend, fellow podcaster and YouTube legend, Pete Matthew, founder of the Meaningful Money channel. He has kindly agreed to fire questions at me. In our conversation, I will reveal the story behind the Retirement Café Handbook, explain the 9-step framework that I believe allows you to create a meaningful and fulfilling retirement, and share some of the conversations that appear in the book from the last 4 years of hosting the Retirement Café podcast. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that episode. But for now, it's back to today's episode. To give you a little insight into some of the key themes in the handbook, I'm bringing back to the podcast a true maestro of understanding human behaviour and the mind-bending world of advertising, none other than Rory Sutherland, the UK Vice Chairman of Ogilvy, a global advertising powerhouse that needs no further introduction. I advise you to hold on to your headphones because Rory isn't just an advertising titan. He's a TED Talk sensation whose thought-provoking talks have been devoured nearly 7 million times. Rory very kindly reviewed my new book and wrote a review which appears on the cover. In this special episode, Rory shares his insights as a behavioural scientist on some of the key themes I address in the Retirement Café Handbook. We dive headfirst into the ocean of retirement fears, including when to retire, mastering your financial resources to last a lifetime, and the intricate art of downsizing. Retirement Café Handbook hits the bookstores from the 12th of September. But for now, sit back and enjoy a small insight into some of the topics in my conversation with Rory Sutherland. Obviously, this is 4.5 years of podcasting, talking to all these experts about retirement, getting all their views, yours included. You've had a chance to take a look at the book. What are your thoughts?
It's a slightly limited look at the book because I've just had retinal surgery. As you know, I had a detached retina.
Yes.
So my reading of non-screens where you can't enlarge it's been a bit limited. But the digital copy, which I read, I found it excellent in the way it's both structured and in the way it actually asks questions that generally don't get asked sufficiently. As you said, when you retire, this is one of the things that I find problematic actually. Which is, it occurs to me, and I think it's occurred now with flexible work, to a lot of people in the workplace around about, 55 plus. The choice you make about your retirement date is playing a massive game of chicken with your finances and your health. And if you make that date absolute, in other words, you don't taper off, okay, you stand the risk of doing what's happened actually to quite a few colleagues of mine at Ogilvy and in the advertising industry in general. One of two things, which is you jump too early and you run out of money, or you don't have the retirement you think you deserve, Or you get bored, by the way, actually, which has happened to one colleague of mine who simply regrets it now, I think, because having had very good health for, 8 years, they're now, frankly, a little bit bored with the Spanish tennis courts. Alternatively, you risk leaving it too late and you're fine for money, but you end up replacing a life filled with business appointments with a life filled with medical appointments, which, isn't really the retirement that most people had in mind. And so it does strike me as something where actually it's in a way unfair for the employer to demand that retirement is absolutely a hard and fast deadline with no blurring. Because you could argue that that people allowed to spend the last 3 years of their working life working 3 days a week, say, would to some extent have the best of both worlds in that, if they did encounter health problems in their 60s, they would have had at least some period of enhanced leisure. And yet they would have earned a bit of money for 3 more years, which would have made some difference to their ability to afford retirement.
And of course, the other thing is the retirement from something. I always have this consideration of you're retiring from something. Is it because you don't like what you're doing?
Yes.
And then I actually want to know, well, why are you doing what you're doing in the first place if it's something that you hate so much? The second thing is, of course, is that...
And there's also a weird thing in banking and finance where people leave banking in their 50s and go and do something like winemaking. I noticed this trend, which is that after having made a load of money effectively out of digits on a screen, the urge to do something tangible, whether it's open a restaurant, whatever it may be, the urge just to make money out of something you can touch and feel and see just becomes, I think, quite strong.
And that real entrepreneurial spirit, I think, and this is not just about making money, it's about making something.
And then I suppose the other thing is the fear,
so
the fear of downsizing in property is an interesting one as well, which is that if you leave it, in a weird way, if you leave it too late, maybe you can't do it at all. So the issue there is that, let's say you stay in your large 4-bedroom place until you're 80. If you survive that long, or 85, actually there's no point in moving because you don't know what you need next. It could be anything from sheltered accommodation to a care home to, just a small cottage. And because it's impossible to decide between those three because you simply don't know, you're left stuck in the big house, that actually the time to get out of the big house might be sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And I talked to a few people on the podcast and mentioned them in the book about that. And we've had some clients who've moved into, in essence, not a care home, but a very nice kind of a carer's estate where there are wardens, but there is a swimming pool and a tennis court and a nice restaurant, and they've just kind of gone, this is where we want to be because of community. The other question that I have asked people and facilitated for them in their 70s, have just said, okay, so do you imagine being here where you're currently living for the rest of your life? And they go, no. And I say, okay, so where can you imagine yourself being? And they go, well, in this community or in that town or in that village. Right, let's do that now then.
Yes.
Let's get into that community where you can still walk to the shops, you can meet friends, you can make friends, you can still volunteer, you can be part of a community now to move on to something in the future.
Sorry, I was just stopping my webcam moving around annoyingly with my weird hand gesture. But no, actually, you're right. No, if you envisage being somewhere else in 5 years' time, then other commitments aside, do it now. I mean, all this comes down to really decision science. And the great thing about decision science is you can't really legislate for other people. Because obviously only you, this is why, top-down central control communism doesn't work very well, because only the individual knows what they really value. And you can't second guess it, and you can't really, nor can you necessarily even research it, because they don't entirely know themselves, but they feel it. But there is the good thing of decision science, which is, no, make the decision you want to make, but only when you've considered all the alternatives. There's a lovely case in decision science, which I thought was quite funny, which was a couple sort of nearing but not at retirement, both teachers who had met sort of 30 years earlier in London. And at the time they lived in London, they both owned a flat which had gone up in value already or something. And they pooled their two flats to buy a house somewhere in West London, which was now worth getting on for £1 million. And he came from Norfolk, she came from London. She found the idea of moving out of London completely intolerable. He wanted to sell the house, buy a nicer house at half price somewhere in Norfolk, retire a bit earlier, and then spend some of the money travelling around the world. Okay? And she found it intolerable. Now, I said, I can't say which is right, but what I can do is give you a new way to think about this, okay, which is, do you think there's anybody in Norfolk, okay, who wins £1 million on the lottery, who goes, fantastic, now we can move into a smaller house in London and work for another 3 years, okay? You know, I'm simply saying that if you reverse the decision, it comes across as a very strange decision. And so there's a certain sort of status quo bias where people may automatically treat where they are now as the default. Yes. And, you know, actually, you know, I mean, you can also get lucky in the sense that we moved to where we live now 20 years ago when we had twins, intending, I think, only to stay there for about 5 or 6 years. And we're still there now 20 years later because we looked at moving twice, and fundamentally the cost of just moving never really brought us sufficient improvement. There was always some other downside to it, which meant that actually staying put is quite cheap. So there's a cost of a move. But I think your point there is very, very good. If you don't envisage yourself there in 5 years' time, if you know, maybe it's time to move now rather than waiting. I think that fear thing possibly leads people to do things which are actually inimical to, you know, the enjoyment of day-to-day life, in order to preserve certain things, you know, new car possibly, okay, which actually is something, you know, reasonably on retirement. You know, you can understand someone with a demanding job can't afford a car that's unreliable or won't start. Especially when you're older, you may be more frightened of that.
And then, of course, the other thing is that we spent, and this is the psychological issue that I'm sure you'll bring a perspective on, which is, you know, you and I have spent all our lives saving money, in essence, trying to amass money for this retirement date that we've all been told that we should be concerned about. Now, and then, of course, once you get there, that what you don't want to do is start spending it because you're terrified. You know, this whole idea, when you're adding to the pot all the time, that you feel that's a real comforting factor. But suddenly seeing that pot drip away, you know, open the tap, and people like me going, yes, Rory, it's absolutely fine to spend £20,000 a year, you know, and your pot decreasing in value as over time, and you're looking at it going, flipping heck, you know, I've spent 40 years accruing this, and now it's disappearing. And then, of course, if we have some stock market volatility, and all that type of stuff, it's like, whoa, dear me, I don't know if I can handle this.
And I notice actually a lot of people. Actually, my father's been fairly sane, but a lot of people in retirement are driven effectively paranoid by that. And one of the things I tend to notice is that they start making what I would call, and who am I to say, because I'm not in their position, but what seemed to me kind of irrational economies. So someone I knew kind of cancelled their newspaper subscription. Okay. But then you continue to go on a £7,000 holiday or something, you know. And to me, I'm not entirely... Now, who's to know? You know, as I said, you can't actually put yourself in other people's shoes. But there seems something strange that one thing I always think is a reliable measure of value for money is, okay, because I think we tend to underestimate it when we buy things, okay, which is how much recurrent pleasure is this going to give me? And so, you know, it's very, very silly. One thing that always annoyed me is when rich people criticised poor people for having large televisions, okay? Because my argument was, look, in terms of a measure which is known in the entertainment industry as cost per entertainment hour, watching television, even if you've got a full Sky subscription, is actually bloody cheap per hour, okay? You know, it really is.
Right.
You know, if you watch 60 hours a month and you pay £60, there isn't much you can do that's fun that costs £1 an hour. And similarly, the same goes for sort of newspaper and magazine subscriptions. You know, I always say when you're buying gadgets, ask yourself, you know, how many hours am I going to get out of this? And, you know, I think, for instance, in female fashion, the average dress bought or the average item of clothing is now worn sort of 6 times, okay? Which makes it actually much worse value for money than it initially appears. You know, when you think of it, you know, hold on, well, you know, that's quite a lot for a day's use. Obviously, there's special occasions and things like that. That's different. But equally, you know, one of my extravagances was a Japanese toilet, which by definition you use every day. And funnily enough, the other extravagance, which I probably defend on those grounds, is that Quooker thing that's a tap that dispenses boiling water. You know, it seems pretty wacko spending what is effectively £600 on a kettle. But if you consider the number of times a day you need boiling water in some shape or form, then amortized across general, you know, the use case and the lifetime of the thing, it's actually not that crazy. And so, I think there's a very interesting, you know, bedding is never a stupid extravagance because by definition, you know, you might get to enjoy it every day. What I think is important about your book is it actually, I think an awful lot of retirement advice effectively suffers from quantification bias, which is it assumes it's got a wealth maximization problem. And of course, the two things that get left out of the equation are both time and what you might call emotional factors, which is the quality of the time, not just the quantity of it. And I think the attempt to reduce it into a kind of equation and a very simple, a very simple sort of optimization problem effectively misses out what's really important about the decision. There's a very good bit of advice from a colleague of mine in New York, actually, at Nudgestock, a chap called Chris Graves, who gave advice. He's repeatedly advised sort of American pension funds to stop talking about, you know, the details of money and to simply say, right, but, you know, you kind of roughly match the demography, okay? But you'd say, here are 10 people in retirement, which could be you in 8, 10, 15 years' time, okay? Which one do you want to be? And the argument is that people are not very good with money, but they're very good at understanding people. And generally, if you take sort of 10 different sort of archetypes, and you say to people, okay, there's this person who basically goes on 6 cruises a year and, you know, has a, you know, brand new car and da-da-da-da, and, you know, this person's got, you know, wants to restore Mustangs and goodness knows what else. And you take sort of 10 archetypes, and generally people have no problem going, yeah, that's me.
Right.
And that would be a very helpful, it's a bit like, I mean, this is an interesting thing, which is quite often what our brains do is we substitute an easier problem for a complex problem. Or we substitute something which we're instinctively good at for something we're instinctively bad at. So I always argue, you know, when you buy a car second-hand, part of you is evaluating the car, but a lot of you is evaluating the person who's selling it. And that's because most of us know more about people, or we've evolved a greater facility for going, do I trust this guy? Is this the kind of guy who'd have the car serviced? Is this the kind of guy who'd actually, you know, reverse the odometer or, you know, cheat the pedals to make the car look newer or whatever it may be? You know, do I trust this person? And because we're better at that question, because we've evolved to be quite good at spotting untrustworthy people, generally the decision will be a mix of looking at the car and looking at the person who's selling it. And we can infer quite a lot from the person about the car. It's not perfect, but it's but then neither is looking at the car perfect, because unless you take it completely to bits, you've got no way of knowing entirely what's inside it. And so I thought that business of actually personalising retirement questions, so you effectively go, you know, one or two of them could be a bit scary, You know, in other words, you have to, you know, you have to work. And, you know, I suppose, you know, you could even say, okay, what's the person you'd like to be ideally, and what's the person with the worst lifestyle you could stand?
So I cover, one of the questions I cover in the book is that, you know, imagine you are, you know, I don't know, let's call yourself 85.
Yeah.
And using that mental model of backcasting rather than trying to tell what the future is going to look like, just move yourself to 85. And hopefully many of us will have had an elderly relative close to us who got to that age. And just look at them and say, just imagine being that person, then looking back, what do you want to have happen? What do you want life to have looked like? You know, if they were reading the epitaph and you were lying in the box and you could hear it, for God's sake. I mean, I don't want to give you nightmares, but you could hear what they were saying in the, in the sermon about your life. You know, what did it look like? How was it? And this opportunity of this retirement time, that's possibly, I kind of feel, is possibly maybe our greatest opportunity for freedom. Is to say, okay, so what do I make sure gets in these 20 years?
And there's a great saying, which
and look backwards rather than look forwards.
That actually we neglect opportunity costs because, as someone said, the things you regret are the things you don't do, not the things you do. You know, that actually, although we're kind of wired to minimise regret, I think, but at the same time, it is a worthwhile thing in prompting you perhaps to recognise that, first of all, you know, not many people on their deathbed say, I wish I'd spent more time in the office.
So, you know, I cover in the book, you know, purpose, self-care, planning, you know, and to me, the whole kind of central tenet, I suppose, at the end is that we want people to have a fulfilling retirement, you know, for them to go, whatever fulfilling means to them. You know, and for you, it might mean continuing work, and for someone else, it might be doing the winemaking, you know, but how do we really uncover that?
I mean, one thing is, you know, one thing to look for, and I'm hopeful that this will happen, is, as I said, that some America, I mean, you notice in America where it's not uncommon in America to go into a branch of, say, Taco Bell or McDonald's, and there's someone aged sort of 67 behind the counter. Much, much rarer in the UK, for whatever reason. Now, I get that. I that's pretty tiring work to be doing when you're that age. But I would hope that shrewder employers realise that actually, and possibly government could encourage this, that there are very, very valuable things. I think it was famously B&Q, wasn't it, which started recruiting older staff, partly because they realised that they actually knew a lot about DIY and could actually deliver meaningful and useful advice. I'd like to see that happening because I'm not sure retirement has to be this absolute backstop. Both my father and my father-in-law worked in some shape or form after they'd notionally retired from their main job, and I think it was good for them in all kinds of ways. You don't want to interfere with your possibilities for, you know, enjoying leisure or golf or your cottage in Portugal or whatever it may be, or your caravan or whatever. But equally, complete inactivity is, in a sense, probably as bad for your health as it is for your finances. I seriously hope that some sort of flexible work provides some, you know, I mean, call centre work could be done fairly flexibly at home by people with, you know, some disability. And there's a very interesting, it's a sort of half charity thing which produces, for direct mail purposes, sort of handwritten letters. It's called Ink Pact. And that was a business created deliberately to help people who are effectively were, you know, had you have to have tolerably good handwriting, but other than that, you don't have to have, you know, mobility. And so the invention, I think, of businesses that are employee focused to a degree rather than customer focused.
Yes.
In other words, there's a whole opportunity here, and people who, you know, in many ways, I think older people will be very, very good call center staff because, you know, generally they're rather good at speaking to people, and they've acquired quite a few life skills which make them better at those things than 20-year-olds are generally. The book is, I mean, as I said, my detached retina hasn't helped me, but every single thing I've read, I mean, the you know, covering things like protecting loved ones from financial abuse, you know, it's a completely balanced read. You know, I almost use the phrase balanced scorecard, which I think is very, very largely lacking in this area, because, you know, the whole, you know, it either turns so exclusively financial that, to be honest, most people will turn off anyway. And so the complete mixture of what you might call financial and optimization with time and quality of life optimization, and of course, as you rightly point out, the most important thing is probably to avoid disaster rather than to achieve perfection. If you can manage to get through life avoiding one of those sort of wipeout moments, that's a...
Yeah, well, it's that classic Warren Buffett statement, I think, or Charlie Munger, I don't know which one, but just says, look, we aim to make less mistakes than everybody else. That's all we're intending to do.
Yeah. There's a great financial paper on that called The Loser's Game, which argues that actually, although we always focus on the winning shots in tennis, the winning player in a tennis game is generally the person who just makes fewer mistakes.
Yeah. And I think that comes down to the role of investing, the role of so many things. But of course, we still want people to take risks, don't we? I mean, Nudge Talk covered that well on Friday. That we still want people to be a little bit out there and to come up with some ideas that without fear of failure.
There's a useful concept you can borrow from Amazon, which I think is sort of standard terminology in Amazon. In terms of risk, by the way, which is the two-way door. So Amazon has this thing called a two-way door, which is something you can try, and it's not going to be catastrophic, and it's reversible. And Amazon always says, look, if it's a two-way door, don't argue it to death, just do it. And in fact, funnily enough, Amazon Web Services was started, which is the most profitable part of Amazon, was started as kind of a two-way door. Yeah. Their business plan didn't really make any sense, apparently, or whatever. There wasn't really a very good argument for it. But the Bezos argument was, look, if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, well, what have we lost? And actually understanding this, the sort of asymmetries of decisions like that, I think is really, really smart. No, so just saying, hey, it's a two-way door, let's not overthink this, give it a try. I think it's a really good policy. And we don't probably distinguish enough between one-way doors and two-way doors.
And maybe coming back down to retirement, of actually considering that and saying, okay, so what is it that I can do? And maybe I will just take a sabbatical. Maybe I will just take some time out. Maybe I'll go and try something new. And what's the worst that can happen? Well, I'm sure we'll talk more about that when we chat again in a few weeks' time. So
fabulous. We will do. Absolutely brilliant.
Wonderful.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rory.
All the best.
A huge thank you once again to Rory for reviewing my book and for joining me today. To pre-order the Retirement Café Handbook, either head to Amazon and search for the book title, or you could check out the show notes wherever you get your podcast for a link. You'll also find links to Rory's book and his TED Talks. If you buy and read the book, which I really hope you will, please do write a review on Amazon. It really helps more people like you find my book and plan for a successful retirement. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to catch the next episode with the legendary Pete Matthew, and that's just coming in 2 weeks' time. So until then, I'm Justin King, helping you feel more informed